Hello, students. It seems like a long time since I last saw you and since we last talked about the Communist Manifesto, so I thought the best thing to do was just to start from the beginning. There's been a lot happening in our lives since we last met up, so I thought this would be the easiest way to sort of get us back on track. So, what we'll do today is we'll start from the very beginning of the Communist Manifesto and we'll work our way towards the end. So, let's begin, as we always do, with a little bit of background. Here is Karl Marx. So Karl Marx is one of our most famous sociologists, and he's one of those people that you've definitely heard of, even if you haven't read anything that he's written. A lot of you said that you had heard about the Communist Manifesto, but you'd never actually read it, and that's not uncommon. It's one of those pieces that we talk about a lot. So here is Marx himself. As you can see, he is an excellent beard haver. He was born in Prussia, as was Friedrich Engels, who we'll talk about in a second. We don't really have Prussia anymore, but this is kind of what Western Europe looked like when they were both born. Germany itself was split up into lots of different kingdoms, and one of those kingdoms was the Kingdom of Prussia. Here it is in orange. There's a little bit of extra Prussia over here. So if you ever hear someone talk about Prussia or the Prussian Empire or the Austrian Empire, which is of course happening at the same time, that's what they're talking about. So Marx himself was Jewish. Remember, you can be Jewish kind of two different ways. You can be religiously Jewish or ethnically Jewish. And so if your mother was Jewish, then so are you. His father was actually a rabbi and his father's father. But when he was little, they converted to Lutheranism, so he didn't identify as Jewish. His father was a lawyer and was an educated white man, much like Marx was an educated white man. So Marx's father was a wealthy lawyer, and he supported Marx through most of his early adult life up until he became so revolutionary that he just couldn't bear it anymore. Marx himself married a wealthy Prussian heiress, always a good idea. So his education was really very strong. He started at the University of Bonn, which is still an excellent university in Germany, where he majored in philosophy. But Marx himself as a man was relatively problematic. Some people argue that he was grumpy because he felt sickly. He was later described as having a weak chest, which probably meant sort of an early heart failure, but it might have been something to do with his lungs. But either way, he was always grumpy, pretty much always drunk, tended to really get in a lot of arguments, some of which ended up in fistfights. He got caught dueling a couple of times, not something we do anymore. So he got kicked out of the University of Bonn, so he never finished his degree there, although he did learn a lot about philosophy. When he got kicked out, he moved to the University of Berlin, and there he was supposed to major in law because his father wanted him to be a lawyer too. But instead, he joined up with a group of radical young philosophers. And I know we don't think of philosophers as particularly radical anymore, but trust me, these guys were considered very radical for their time. They were super into Hegel, and they called themselves the Young Hegelians, which I think would look pretty cool on the back of a jacket. Never seen it done, but it could be. So while he was in Berlin, he started running with the Young Hegelians, and he met a bunch of radical philosophers and joined a poetry club and joined a drinking club, which I imagine turned out poorly. But at least while he was there, he managed to finish his education. And he wrote his dissertation on the sort of relationship between religion and philosophy. And his argument was that philosophy was better because he was a material philosopher. So he believed that it was better to believe in things that we could see and measure than it was to believe in religion. But as you can imagine, that was an unpopular opinion. So the University of Berlin actually didn't give him his PhD. They didn't approve of his dissertation. He had to get it from a different university. So once he finished his PhD, he started working as a journalist. And this was, at the time, still not a very well-paying position. We don't pay journalists these days, and we didn't pay them then. So he was working for these sort of radical underground newspapers, which was part of the problem. So he basically kept writing these really inflammatory articles, and he would say things about, how the government was bad and how capitalism was bad. And as you can imagine, people also did not care for that, so they kept exiling him. So he got exiled from Germany, and he went to France, and then he got exiled from France, and he went to Brussels, and he got exiled from Brussels, and he went to England. So he spent most of his adult life kind of jumping around, trying to publish and being, sort of thwarted by the powers that be. He got censored a lot, and so basically he was for and on the run for most of his adult life. He was publishing, and he was known among the people who read his work, but it was never really what we would call a successful career. Some of his major works I've put over here on the right On the Jewish question was his first major work, and it is not the Jewish question you're thinking of, I promise. What they were trying to figure out at the time was whether everyone needed to be the same religion in the state, like whether it would help essentially the community to get along if everyone was the same religion. And he argued that it didn't. He actually argued in favor of religious freedom. So he said it was okay if some people were Jewish and some people were Christian, but again, an unpopular opinion. So that was in 1843. In 1848, of course, the Manifesto. And after that, he began a more sort of economic critique. So political economy is essentially a combination of like sociology and economics and political science and basically the ways that money changes or influences the way that society runs. So it's a pretty crucial science, but we don't really have that in America. So in 1859, he published The Critique of Political Economy, very famous. And then he wrote 3 successive volumes of Capitalismus, none of which are that great, and I don't recommend them. His family life, again, pretty dark. So since he spent most of his life on the run, he was never really able to like set down roots and like raise the family the way that I think he intended to. So he married that Prussian heiress that I mentioned before, Jenny, that's her there on the right. And they had a lot of children. They had at least 10 children, or 7 children, sorry, but only 3 of them lived because they were always living in such squalor. You know, they were always moving and they didn't always have heat and water. So it wasn't uncommon for children not to make it out of childhood at that time, but still that's a, pretty dark to only have 3 of them live. And again, Marx himself was pretty sickly for most of his life. And it's kind of a chicken-egg situation. Like, was he sickly because he was drunk all the time? Maybe. Was he drunk all the time because he felt bad? Maybe. So it's kind of hard to tell the degree to which his ailments sort of informed the rest of his life. But basically, he was poor, on the run, and not feeling great for most of his adult life. So here's Friedrich Engels, another excellent beard haver. And I think he never gets enough credit. I think Engels is kind of great. He was also Prussian, and his father, also wealthy, but his father was an industrialist. So remember, this is right at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and his father owned a bunch of factories where they made fabric most of the time and garments. And so his father wanted him to take over the family business. So most of his education was focused in business, but he secretly attended philosophy classes. So he and Marx met when they were both part of the Young Hegelians. So over the course of Engels' life, he traveled a lot to his father's factories, and what he was supposed to do there was like figure out how to run things better, how to make things more efficient. But what he really did there was notice that the people who worked in the factories had pretty terrible lives. They were working in pretty terrible conditions. And so he got further radicalized. So instead of trying to figure out how to run the factories better, he was trying to figure out how to make the lives of the factory workers better, which ultimately we approve of, but his father did not care for that. So right after visiting the factories for the first time, he wrote a book about the conditions of the working class in England, which was later republished in 1845. His first major work, of course, was the outline of the critique of political economy, no problem, just a minor work. And then, of course, the Manifesto, and then much later in life, he wrote a piece about private property and essentially capital and the way that that informs family life. Engels wasn't married until much later in his life. When he was young and he was touring his father's factories, he actually met this young woman who was like a radical revolutionary. Her name was Mary Burns. She was very cool. And he and Mary Burns lived together for years. They lived together for 20 years, actually, until her own death. And then he married her little sister, which, I don't know. But for most of his life, Engels had to support Marx, and he had to support Marx's family. So ultimately, ironically, he ended up going back to work for his own father because he needed to earn enough money to support everybody. So after all that time being, radical revolutionaries, he ended up right back in the factory. But this picture is of Marx and Engels here on the right, and their wives and one of their daughters. So Marx and Engels were sort of simultaneously well-known and disrespected. So the people who liked them really liked them, like all the communists were super into them, of course, but the people who didn't like them really didn't like them and kept kicking them out of countries and cities and libraries. So in a way, they were both really respected writers, really respected authors and academics, and in another way, they were just deeply frowned upon. So it was basically impossible for them to get work except for in the underground communist newspapers. So since they were so well known in the communist community, they were actually commissioned to write the Communist Manifesto. And there it is, Manifest der Kommunistischen Partei. So originally it came out in 1848, and of course it was published in German. Marx wrote it really all in a hurry. He and Engels were commissioned to write it, but as may sound familiar to some of you, they put it off until the very last minute, and he basically just like crammed and stayed up for like 6 days and 6 nights, they say, that could be a legend, in the library in England and sort of wrote it all in one fell swoop. He procrastinated, and then finally it was time, and he just sort of like spit out the whole thing at once. So it's a little bit messy because of that. You know how I'm always telling you that you need to edit? Same thing. This piece could have done with some editing, but it's still one of the most famous pieces of all time. One of the reasons that I think it's so fun to read and so fun to teach is that it's just full on propaganda. It's meant to be propaganda. It's meant to be read, you know, out loud. It's meant to be angry. It's meant to be engaging. And so if you find yourself sort of snorting at how dramatic he is, you're not wrong. It's dramatic. So it's a really important piece, and I think it's one of the things that's vital about CORE. Like, this is what I think we're supposed to be reading in the CORE program, because if you want to go forth and talk about how much nonsense this is, you can, but you should read it first. You know, we should know of what we speak. So let's get into the Communist Manifesto. Before we start, I wanted to tell you some things about communism because, ironically, even though this is the manifesto of the Communist Party, they never talk about what communism is supposed to be. So assuming that you are not already part of the Communist Party, here are some of the guiding principles. Basically, their concern was the gap between the wealthy and the poor. They had noticed that it had become much bigger than it ever had at any point in history, and they had decided that the problem was the means of production. Basically, some people owned the means of production and everyone else worked for them. So the issue was the wealth divide, and the issue behind the wealth divide was the property. So basically, the problem was that the means of production were not equally owned by everybody. And the way that you could tell was that there was a huge class struggle, that basically the bourgeoisie and the proletarians, we'll talk about them in a second, were just sort of locked in a battle against one another. So the goal of communism is the communal ownership of property, and specifically the communal ownership of the means of production. So the goal of communism is that everybody owns everything, and that we all share. So one of the most famous sort of catchphrases is from each according to their abilities and to each according to their needs, which means that everybody has to work as hard as they are able, but everybody will be given as much as they need to survive. So that is essentially what communism is. It's really much more complicated than that, and the way that people have done it in the real world is much more complicated than that, but that's, I think, something that you do need to know going in. All right, so let's dig into part 1, bourgeois and proletarians. One of my favorite things about the Communist Manifesto is that it has the greatest beginning and ending lines of almost any piece of literature. So here is the beginning line. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Pretty good, right? Such a good sentence. So basically his whole argument is that the entirety of history is basically one class struggling against another class. And in a lot of ways, he's not wrong. If you think about the history books that you've read, or even the history textbooks that you've read, very often what we're talking about is class struggles, and we're talking about the way that the rich have held down the poor, or we're talking about slavery, or we're talking about war. So you could make this argument that all of history is just class struggles. However, you could also argue that there's much more to history than that, that there's much more about religion or about science or about love. The idea that all of history is class struggles is inherently incorrect, but at the same time, it's an extraordinary sentence. So I think this is a great example of why I love the Communist Manifesto so much. It's simultaneously very true on the surface and deeply untrue when you dig into it, which I think makes it kind of fun. So that's the best sentence. He starts with this idea that on the one hand, having the rich and the poor is nothing new. This idea that we've sort of always divided ourselves into social class, and that we've always had some people who had more than other people. In the earlier epochs of history, we find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders, a manifold gradation of social rank. So let's take a brief vocabulary break. When he says an epoch, he means essentially like a chunk of time. So the epochs of history is not epic, like an epic story. It's more of like time, a time period. And also when he says a manifold gradation, that's a kind of a beautiful phrase, but we don't use it anymore. So a gradation is when you sort of measure something on a gradient. Like if you think about on Instagram, you probably have like a color gradient. It's like that. So a gradation of social rank is suggesting that there's a range from rich to poor. There's not just rich and poor, there's like a bunch of stuff in the middle. So this one, true. We have always had rich and poor. We have always had a sort of a range of rich and poor. On the right here is a very old engraving, and it's a great example of how we've made art for thousands of years that features both the rich in the castle and the poor tending the field. So this idea that rich and poor have always existed, solid. His argument is that right now it's worse than ever. So he's not saying that this idea that rich and poor exist is new, he's just saying that it's different now. Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses, however, this distinctive feature. It has simplified the class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat. So essentially, we are changing from a sliding scale of wealth into a binary of wealth. We used to have a bunch of people like at different levels, and now we have two, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So this is what those two things are. The bourgeoisie is basically the wealthy. They're the capitalists, the owners of the means of production. They're the people who own the factory, the people who do the employing. And the proletariats are essentially the workers. The people who sell their labor, the people who essentially are at the bottom. In modern terms, sometimes we think of it as like the 1% and the 99%, but this is very antiquated language, but I promise you'll hear it come back. In class, we talked about the word bourgeoisie and how it sort of transitioned to bougie. It's sort of a modern interpretation where it's like people who are sort of obsessed with wealth, or at least obsessed with displaying wealth, whether or not they really have it, very bougie. So if that helps, that's a good way to think about it. So now he's concerned with how we got here. If we used to have a gradient, why do we now have a binary? And he says that it's due to essentially social change, but also the way that we produce things. What he's really talking about here is the Industrial Revolution. We see, therefore, how the modern bourgeoisie is itself the product of a long course of development, of a series of revolutions in the modes of production and exchange. So what he's talking about when he says the modes of production is essentially machinery, he's talking about the way that, you remember how Adam Smith said we used to make like 5 needles over the course of a day, and now several of us can make 2,000 needles? And we had all that talk about like division of labor. This is what he's talking about here. So when he says modes of production, he's talking about the way that we literally make things. And when he's talking about exchange, he's talking about the sort of early versions of globalization. So the difference here is that now a few people own factories and everybody else works in the factories. There's a whole dramatic change in the modes of production. And the other difference, of course, that we are selling the things that we make far and wide. He also argues that the reason that we have allowed this sort of change is that the people who are in charge of the government are also the people who are in charge of industrialization. So essentially the bourgeoisie have not only taken over work and employment and production, they have also taken over the government in order to make their lives easier. So this part might sound kind of familiar. The bourgeoisie has, at last, since the establishment of modern industry and of the world market, conquered for itself in the modern representative state exclusive political sway. So his argument here is that in addition to taking over industry, they have taken over government. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. So this argument might sound familiar if you've been paying attention to the presidential race, or if you've been listening to politics for the last few years. What he's essentially arguing is that the wealthy have set up the government solely to benefit them, that the government is a committee for managing the common affairs. So when he says that, he's talking about the government as essentially hired hands to make it easier for the wealthy to make more money. So an example of this that we have talked about in class is the role of the lobbyist. So a lobbyist essentially is somebody who works for a special interest group. So it would be illegal, for instance, for the oil industry to just hand money to politicians, but it is not illegal for the oil money to, via a third party, a lobbyist, sort of contribute to campaign funds or hold, fancy dinners or, sort of advocate for the interest of the politician, if you will. So you can't directly hand them money, but you can, through a third party, contribute several $100,000 to their reelection campaign. And in so doing, encourage them gently to vote for your special interest. And that's a very common thing. It's not, ethical, but it is legal. So if you're looking for a future career, I do recommend being a lobbyist. Lots of good money there. Borderline evil, but, still get paid. Okay. So now Marx starts to get into this concept of globalization. And he doesn't call it that because we hadn't started calling it that yet. But what he's talking about is the way that the means of production and also the products that we're making have begun to spread out. So this idea of factories making a whole lot of one thing was brand new, and not everybody in the world was doing it. So he is talking about spreading to different countries, but it's really interesting to me because he didn't even know yet, the degree to which globalization would become a thing. So the way that he talks about it sounds really invasive, like it sounds like sort of an invasive species or something like that. And you could make an argument that that's exactly what it is. So this is what he says. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. So here he's talking about the way that the Industrial Revolution just changes society. Like it goes into all these different places in the world where they'd never heard of such a thing, and it dramatically changes the way that they live. So I think one way to think about this in the modern world is how we think about like third world countries. We think about countries where they're only sort of just experiencing industrialization. And he was essentially calling that. He was saying, yeah, this is what's going to happen. This is what is happening. And it's just interesting to me that he couldn't possibly have predicted the degree to which it came true. Like, for instance, when he's talking about the rapid improvements of instruments of production, they didn't even have robotics yet. Or he says the immensely facilitated means of communication, like he's talking about, steamships getting letters there quickly, or the, telegraph. The things that he's talking about here became true in ways that I don't think he could ever have predicted. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e. to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image. And again, here he's just correct. This is one of the things that he absolutely correctly predicted. So this way that we used to all be sort of different, and we used to all be separate, and we used to have separate identities, is becoming increasingly homogenized. And this is something that anthropologists worry about a lot, and you've probably heard things about like trying to save, the French language or trying to protect traditional arts. Like that's something that people are really worried about, that these cultures will lose their identities. And what he's talking about here is the way that the, quote, industrialized world sort of forced their way of living onto other communities and other cultures. And again, he was correct. The other thing that he is sort of just on the cusp of, but that he is accurately predicting, is the way that we're going to change our relationship with work. So remember, we've been talking in class about how the Industrial Revolution changed not just the work we did, but the way we thought about it. So when we lived on farms, everybody did all of the same work. Or you might have artisans who are specialized in some kind of work or another. But essentially, your work was your livelihood. You made the things that you were going to eat. You made the things that you were going to wear. And industrialization changed everything about that. Like all of a sudden, now you're just making rivets, and you're making more rivets, and you're making more rivets. And so you become sort of disconnected with your work, which is something we'll talk about in a minute with Durkheim. And you also become part of a gigantic labor force. So again, if you remember, we talked about how in previous generations, people didn't leave their village. Like a person might travel 30 miles in the course of their life, but they certainly didn't go into towns. They didn't go into cities. They didn't go work in a room with 1,000 other people. They might never meet 1,000 other people. So this was a huge dramatic change, just a big social change. And what he's talking about here is the workforce in terms of like how many people were gathered together and how many things they could make once they were all streamlined and organized and inside the factory. So this has not just changed the workforce, it's changed the way that people think about work. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created a more massive and a more colossal production forces than have all the preceding generations together. And again, this was true. They were producing things that nobody had ever seen before, and they were producing them at a rate that nobody had ever seen before. But one of the things that was sort of an unexpected outcome of getting this many people together was that now you had created a unified workforce. They weren't just a bunch of strangers. They were a bunch of people with the same job, with the same problems, with the same living situations. And so essentially by bringing all of these people together to do terrible, boring, low-paid work, the bourgeoisie created an army of people who technically could rise up and overthrow them. The weapons with which the bourgeoisie felled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. So here he's talking about like the literal gathering together of people. But not only has the bourgeoisie forged the weapons that bring death to itself, it has also called into existence the men who are to wield these weapons, the modern working class, the proletarians. So his argument here is that by gathering all of these people together to work for you, you may have accidentally created an army. However, the men who are gathered together aren't quite so cohesive as they need to be yet, and part of this is due to their relationship with the work itself. Now, if you were a baker or a cobbler, you had some sort of connection to your work, like you made the bread, you ate the bread, you made the shoes, you wore the shoes. But if you're working in a factory, you have no relation to the thing that you're making. You don't love the machine that you work with. And so this is really reminiscent of the film that we watched, what seems like hundreds of years ago, the Charlie Chaplin film, Modern Times. And Chaplin was, a pretty well-read dude. Like he had definitely read Marx, and he was definitely thinking about this sort of language. And this part should sound familiar to you. Owing to the extensive use of machinery and to division of labor, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character, and consequently all charm for the workman. He becomes an appendage of the machine. So in Modern Times, Charlie Chaplin was shown being literally eaten by the machine and then spit back out. He was not just an appendage in the sense that he was a vital function of what the machine was supposed to do. He was also an appendage in the sense that he was just seen as part of the machine. He wasn't a person. He was just a riveter. He was just a person, or like really an object that made the rivets attached to themselves. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeois class and of the bourgeois state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the overlooker, and above all, by the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself. So again, this language sounds familiar. You've probably heard people talk about being slaves of the machine or raging against the machine. This is something that people have really latched onto. And for those of you that have sort of extremely dull part-time jobs, this may sound familiar. You probably don't love your hamburgers or your chicken sandwiches that you flip over. You probably don't love the movie tickets that you tear in half. But this idea of sort of being enslaved by your work is very dramatic language. But again, if you worked in a factory, probably surprisingly accurate language. So what he's talking about here is the sort of personal emotional toll of doing the same work over and over and over and over, and the way that a lot of people felt controlled by the work, controlled by their managers, and controlled by the owners in the sense that they didn't have the ability to quit. So for some of you, this may sound incredibly true. This may sound very reminiscent of the work that you do. And for the rest of you, we'll check back in 10 or 15 years, see how you feel. So at this point, he starts to talk about the class struggles and the ways that class struggles are political struggles. So here he's talking about very big picture issues. He's talking about class struggles in terms of wealth, in terms of housing, in terms of power, in terms of government. And this, I think, is also one of those things that remains true. Very often, the things that we're arguing about politically are also class issues. They're also issues of wealth and issues of power. Like if we think about education, one of the things that we hear a lot, especially in our current political debates, is this idea about student loans, or should college be free? That's a political struggle, but that's very much a class issue. Or what about healthcare? We're all suddenly very interested in healthcare, I think. And healthcare is a great example of something that is a political issue right now, but has always been a wealth issue. An even more timely example might be water. Is water a human right? Is it something that only the wealthy should have access to? And generally we think, no, it isn't. But these days it's a political issue as well. This idea that perhaps who has the best water is down to a political schema. So this idea of political struggles being just a mirror of class struggles is one of the arguments that really held true. One of the arguments that really survived the manifesto and became sort of part of our general political scheme, like part of our general political knowledge. So the question here is that if there are class struggles and that those class struggles are political, will the bottom class realize that? Will the poorest among us, the 99%, realize that they are in a lot of ways unified and that they care about the same things and that they're struggling with the same things? And Marx's answer is, if they do realize that, the downfall of the wealthier class is inevitable. He is convinced that it is coming soon, that the workers will gather together, that they'll rise up, that they'll unify, and that they'll overthrow the bourgeoisie. And his argument here is that, in fact, the bourgeoisie brought this on themselves because they sort of organized the proletariats by literally getting them together in factories, but also by creating the situations in which they live. What the bourgeoisie, therefore, produces is its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. As it turns out, it was not inevitable. You could argue that the proletariat did rise, although a lot of people argue that they rose by merit of unionization and not by merit of radicalization. But still, he was pretty sure that they were about to rise up and destroy the bourgeoisie, and they, didn't. But this is still something that you hear people say to each other. If you think back to like the We Are the 99 movement or the Occupy Wall Street movement, like this is something that people say a lot. If we could just band together, we could overthrow the wealthy and the powerful. So if you are currently going through your requisite communist phase that 19-year-old sophomores at liberal arts colleges are required to go through, this is a very powerful thought. This idea that if you could just gather the people together, if you could just get them organized, you could overthrow the power that be. Okay, part 2, proletarians and communists. So in this part, Marx is trying to argue that all of the proletarians should become communists, that there's a lot of benefits for them. So he starts with just a list of, 3 little things that we can do. The immediate aim of the communists is the same as that of all the other proletarian parties: formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrow of the bourgeois supremacy, and conquest of political power by the proletariat. All right, so no problem, just 3 things. The first thing is, of course, the hardest thing. If you've ever tried to get a group of people together to go to dinner, you're aware of how hard it is to harness even 5 or 6 people. Imagine trying to organize the entire proletariat. They basically refused to get in formation, as Beyonce told us to do. And so that's been the major problem for all of these political revolutions. It is very hard to get people to get in formation. But let's assume you did. You got some people in formation. Next step, overthrow the bourgeois supremacy. How should you do that, you ask? I don't know, and neither does Marx. He never gets that far. The final step, of course, conquest of political power. Again, we never got that far. So it's kind of a nice list. It's only 3 things. All you got to do is get organized, have a little war, and start a new government. But it's sort of lacking in details about how you might do such a thing. So now we get into one of the 2 least popular ideas about communism. So if you ever hear people talking about communism, usually they have 2 primary complaints. And one is, I want to have my own house. And the other is, if we don't pay people, they'll get lazy. So let's start with my house. The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. So here he's drawing a distinction between owning private property and owning like all of the private property yourself. But modern bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products that is based on class antagonisms, on the exploitation of the many by the few. So his argument here is not that it's bad to own property, it's just that it's bad for 1% of people to own all the property. Like, he's not saying you can't have a house. He's saying it feels like a problem that some people have really gigantic houses and the rest of people are squished together in basement apartments. So if you have seen the film Parasite that won the Best Oscar this year, it's excellent. It's a Korean film about this family that works for another family, and I don't want to ruin it, but while you're, on social seclusion, this is a great thing to watch. I do recommend it. So this problem of all of the poor people working for a few of the rich people, again, not a new problem. So what he's arguing here is that the concentration of wealth, and specifically the concentration of property in the hands of a few, is the big problem. In this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up into one single sentence: abolition of private property. So again, this is one of those sentences that is so important, it gets its own slide. This is one of the big ideas of communism, that essentially if you have private property, you have power. If you have property, you have capital, you have wealth, you have power. So if you think back to Adam Smith, who we read recently, he talked about this. And if you think back even further to Rousseau, who we read at the beginning of the semester, he talked about this. You might remember that line from Rousseau where he says that the first man to put up a fence and say this is mine was the man who essentially ruined it for the rest of us. That's what he's talking about here. This idea that if you can accumulate private property, you can accumulate wealth, and then you will have accumulated power. That there's essentially a direct relationship between the three. So his argument is that if we get rid of the ownership of private property, we might be able to further equalize wealth, and then we might be able to further equalize power. So the reason that they want to get rid of private property is not because they don't want you to have a house, it's just that they don't want you to hoard your property and your wealth like a little dragon. So he knows that people don't like this argument. And this is one of my favorite parts because he starts to get really sassy. So he starts to directly address the haters. We communists have been reproached with the desire of abolishing the right of personally acquiring property as the fruit of man's own labor, which property is alleged to be the groundwork of all personal freedom, activity, and independence. So this, again, should sound familiar. This is what Rousseau was talking about, this idea that the property that you own is the fruit of your labor. It's the result of all of your hard work. And his argument is, no, it isn't. It's the result of your accumulated wealth and power. Like, you didn't work hard to own your house. You stepped on other people to earn your house. Hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned property. Do you mean the property of the petty artisan and of the small peasant, a form of property that preceded the bourgeois form? There is no need to abolish that. The development of industry has to a great extent already destroyed it and is destroying it daily. So, this argument, he's talking about people being afraid that we're going to shut down the small shops, the mom and pop shops, like the sort of Main Street in an old school downtown. And what he's saying is, oh, are you so worried we're going to take your business? You're so worried we're going to take your property? Like, look around you. You don't own property. You don't own your own shop. You don't own your own house. Like, what are you afraid we're going to take from you? It's very sassy, but on the one hand, kind of true. Like, if you think about it, this is something that we've been seeing, especially in the past couple decades, this idea that we don't go to small shops anymore. We go to Walmart. We buy things from Amazon because they're just so much cheaper, and it's so much easier. So this idea that a few people are going to own all of the places that we buy things from, again, pretty prescient. He's really looking forward to the future here. There's these, sort of abandoned main streets all over America because most of us at this point are buying from either the Walton family or Jeff Bezos. So if we're worried about the development of industry destroying, small shops, maybe we shouldn't worry about that because it already happened. So now he starts to really get into this argument of the problem with property is that only a few people own it. And also he gets extra sassy. You are horrified at our intending to do away with private property. But in your existing society, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population. Its existence for the few is solely due to its non-existence in the hands of those 9/10. So he's really digging into this argument, this sort of like 1% versus 99%. And he's saying that 9/10 of you already don't own property. Like, what are you so worried about? So In an attempt to sort of make this more relevant to our modern world, I wanted to look into whether this is still true. And the good news is it's not wholly true. It's not that 9 of us don't own houses out of 10, but it is that maybe 4 of us don't own houses out of 10. So this is a graph about United States home ownership rate. And we're looking here at 1966 through 2014. And as you can see, usually it remains pretty steady in the 60s. Usually about 60% of Americans own their own home, or more accurately, 60% of Americans own a home. Whether they own more than one is a different question we'll get to later. As you can see, over the course of time, it goes up and down a little, but this is an excellent example of a way that a graph can sort of like lie with statistics. If you look on the left-hand side here, we're looking at the difference between 60% and 70%. So even though this graph is moving what looks like kind of alarmingly, it's still only moving 10%, so don't get too worried. In this graph, you can see 2 little recessions. Here's the sort of small recession in the 80s, and the Great Recession, as we call it, in about 2008. So home ownership actually is kind of what caused the Great Recession. If you'll notice here in the late 90s, building up into the early 2000s, home ownership went way up, and that's because of what we call the housing bubble. So basically, they were giving a home loan to anyone who wanted it, basically anyone who asked, and they weren't looking at, can you afford this house? They were just looking at, do you want this house? And that was a problem, because basically a lot of Americans bought houses, but as it turned out, they could not afford them. So a lot of them went into foreclosure, and then the banking industry sort of collapsed, and then the housing industry sort of collapsed, and it was a whole big mess. So the Great Recession itself was essentially caused by our desire to own homes and our inability to afford those homes. So this graph is looking at housing more currently. So the last graph cut out in 2016. So this one takes up right about there. This is January of 2017 through January of 2020. And again, you'll notice that even though this graph looks kind of exciting with a lot of ups and downs, they have really narrowed the field. So we're really only looking at the difference between 63% and 65%. So has home ownership gone back up? Like a little bit. It went, from 63% to 65%, but basically it remains steady. So what I'm really trying to say here is that it's not necessarily true that 9/10 of us don't own houses, but it is pretty much true that about 4/10 of us don't own houses. So he brings it back, and finally, I think more clearly explains this idea of why he's concerned about property ownership. Property, in its present form, is based on the antagonism of capital and wage labor. Capital is, therefore, not a personal, it is a social power. So again, his argument here is that if you own property, it's not that your house makes you powerful all by itself, it's that the fact that you can afford a house makes you powerful. The fact that you have monetary capital is something that you can turn into social capital. So one of the things that we've been talking about all semester is this idea that very often the people who are in the government, the senators and the representatives, are already wealthy because it takes so much money just to run for office in the first place. So essentially, that's an example of the way that the wealthiest among us are running the government, because the wealthiest among us can afford to. So essentially, the having of capital can be translated directly into the having of power. Okay, so now we start to explore another idea that has been very popular all semester, and that's the idea of minimum wage. So if you remember when we were reading Adam Smith, he was saying that minimum wage should cover one man, his wife, and 2 babies. Maybe 4 babies if you're feeling pretty generous. But his idea was essentially that minimum wage should be enough for one man to support a family. And not just to support the family, but to keep that family healthy, because that's a good thing for workers, and to keep that family happy, because that's a good thing for workers, and to keep that family intact and healthy enough that those babies eventually become workers themselves. So for Adam Smith, the idea of minimum wage was as much as it took for a man to support his family and raise the next generation of workers. For Marx, the idea of minimum wage is a lot darker. The average price of wage labor is a minimum wage, i.e. that quantum of the means of subsistence which is absolutely requisite to keep the laborer in bare existence as a laborer. So a quick vocabulary break. Subsistence is just staying alive. It's basically not necessarily living, but surviving. So Marx's argument is that the minimum wage is precisely as much as is required to keep that laborer alive until he comes to work tomorrow. So this is no longer about a family, and this is no longer about health or happiness or the gradual accumulation of wealth. It's about how much do I have to pay you so that you will stay alive long enough to come back tomorrow. The bare existence as a laborer. So Marx's argument is that the factories are only paying, literally as much as they have to. So one of the things, again, that we've been thinking about over the course of the semester is the way that minimum wage is determined and what you can afford if you are getting paid a minimum wage. So this is a map of what minimum wage was in every state in 2019. It was supposed to go up in 2020. We'll see what happens now. But if you notice, it's very similar to all of the other maps that we've looked at. Generally speaking, the wealthiest places are on the coasts. They tend to be on the west coast and east coast, the northeast specifically, and the poorest places tend to be congregated in the southeast. And this map is no different. We're looking here at minimum wage ranging from $7.25, which is the federal minimum, up to about $14, which is really as high as it goes, and it pretty much only does that in a couple places. So this is how much people are being paid if they're working at minimum wage per state. And this graph is how much you would need to get paid per hour if you wanted to be able to rent a 2-bedroom apartment. So this is based on the state average. So they're basically looking at how much a 2-bedroom costs over the whole state. So it could be a little bit inaccurate if you're thinking about a state like New York or even a state like Georgia. I mean, we all know that a 2-bedroom is going to cost a very different price in Brookhaven than it would, somewhere in a much more rural area. So if you look at this map, though, one of the things that you'll notice is that the amount of money you need to be earning per hour in order to afford a rental home is vastly different than minimum wage. And in fact, for most places, you would need to be earning at least double of minimum wage. So let's look specifically at Georgia. So here they're calculating that it's going to be about $18.42 per hour that you would need to rent a 2-bedroom. And if you recall, in Georgia, the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. So you would need more than double what a minimum wage worker is making if you wanted a 2-bedroom apartment. And also keep in mind, this is just how much you would need to rent a 2-bedroom. This doesn't take food into account or clothing or medication or any of that. So the idea that minimum wage is enough to subsist upon might not even really be true anymore. And it certainly isn't true in the Adam Smith sense, where a minimum wage would be enough to keep you and your family alive. So have a look at this map if you have the time. It's kind of interesting how much money you would need in order to rent a place. The most expensive, of course, is always Hawaii. Okay, so now we get into the second main objection to communism. So the other thing that people very often say about communism is that it won't work because everyone is getting paid the same thing for different kinds of labor, or for different amounts of work, or for different difficulties, like levels of work. And so one of the things that people object to is this idea that a neurosurgeon will be making the same amount of money as a garbage man. And they say, but why would I go through that education? Why would I go through all of that effort, to get trained to do something if my paycheck is going to be the same as somebody who does, sort of the easiest work available? And Marx's argument here is that this way of thinking about paychecks is itself a recent invention and is itself the fault of this sort of like bourgeois mode of production. And if you think about sort of agricultural societies, of course there weren't paychecks, like you did the work that you had to do. And so his argument is, what if we just worked because we needed to work to make society go forward? What if you became a doctor because you wanted to be a doctor and not because you wanted the paycheck? Or, what if you became a garbage man because somebody had to and not because you wanted the paycheck? So he is saying that the way that we think about work and the way that we think about getting paid for work is itself the problem. It has been objected that upon the abolition of private property, all work will cease and universal laziness will overtake us. And so he knows what people are saying about communism, and he knows what his detractors are saying. And that's what it is, that if we stop paying people for work, or if we pay everybody exactly the same amount, that they're just going to stop working. They're going to stop trying. They're going to not do the harder jobs. They're just going to kind of chill. And he says that this does not have to be the case. He says, your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of this bourgeois production and bourgeois property. This misconception you share with every ruling class that has preceded you. So again, he's saying you are thinking about work as how monetarily valuable it is, and instead you should be thinking about work in terms of how socially valuable it is. That you shouldn't be concerned about how much you're going to get paid or how much the guy next to you is going to get paid, and that in fact you're only getting that idea from the bourgeois people who employ you. That previously we did not have this idea, and the fact that we have this idea now is down to the people who own the factories and are trying to convince you to compete against the people who are next to you. So he argues that essentially work should not be something that we do for a paycheck. Work should be something that we do for the sort of general betterment of society. So it's an interesting argument, I think. It's sort of this argument that work should be like, chores. You load and unload the dishwasher because somebody has to, or you do the laundry because somebody has to. You collect the garbage because somebody has to. You do, childcare because somebody has to. So you don't do your work because it's the highest paying job available. You do your work because either it needs to be done, or if you're lucky, because you love it. Maybe you'll end up being like this woman who reads books to therapy dogs, because that sounds very nice. So the idea is essentially we think of work as directly tied to paychecks, but in Marx's world, we wouldn't have to. So this argument is unpopular. This is one of the ones that hasn't panned out quite as well as we want to. It turns out that humans are very incentive-based, and there's very little we won't do for a treat. And this is something that, again, you've noticed. Some of you probably picked your majors based on how much money you could make after you left college. And that's in no way unusual, and it's in no way a bad idea. But this argument that Marx is making is like, essentially, what if we didn't have to do that? And in fairness, that has never worked. But it might. It could work. I don't know. You guys try it and let me know what you find. So next, Marx gets into this idea that the fight between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, sometimes we think of as down to one person, but we could also think of it as reflected in the bigger picture. That it's not just a bourgeois person holding down a proletariat person. You could also think of it as a wealthy nation holding down a less wealthy nation. So when he says the working men have no country, what he means is that it's equally terrible to be a member of the proletariat in every country. That it's as terrible to be a factory worker in Vietnam as it is in Venezuela. That essentially the things that make us different are not related to the work that we do, and especially are not related to the poverty that we're experiencing. So he says, national differences and antagonisms between people are daily more and more vanishing, owing to the development of the bourgeoisie, to freedom of commerce, to the world market, the uniformity in the modes of production and the conditions of life corresponding thereto. So essentially he's saying it's increasingly the same all around the world. The way that we live, the money that we're being paid, the things that we expect out of our employers, increasingly the same all around the world. So it's no longer, the Prussians fighting the Germans. It's more all the proletariats fighting all the bourgeoisie, and the country that you're in doesn't matter quite as much as the social class that you're in. In proportion, as the exploitation of one individual by another is put an end to, the exploitation of one nation by another will also be put an end to. In proportion, as the antagonism between classes within the nation vanishes, the hostility of one nation to another will come to an end. So again, it's the small sort of antagonism between one worker and one employer is mirrored in the bigger antagonism between a poor country and a wealthy country. So I think one of the sort of great examples of this is one of our prime examples of colonialism. So on the left here are the traditional sort of tribal boundaries that the native African people drew for themselves. And on the right are the boundaries that the sort of white men came in and drew for themselves. So in the 1880s, basically all of the wealthy powers in Western Europe got together and decided that they wanted the things that were in Africa. They wanted the minerals and the oil and the diamonds and the slaves. And so the fairest thing to do was just to divide it equitably among themselves. And this is very colonialism. This is like, peak old white guy. So what they did was they sat down in Berlin and just divided Africa amongst themselves in a way that they could agree upon. Did they ask any Africans? No, they did not. Who cares about them? What they did was ask each other. So on the left, the way that the people drew, a continent for themselves. On the right, the way that some, random people who didn't even live there drew it. So this is sort of, I think, a big picture example of class antagonism. It's not always one person holding down another person. Sometimes it is one country holding down another country. And Marx's argument is that communism could prevent that because communism would bring equality to the places that were previously poor, and of course also to the places that were previously rich. And that if we had this sort of big picture equality, we would not have this big picture antagonism. Again, this did not pan out. It could, maybe, but given the way that people, sort of chose to implement communism, which was, again, always incorrectly, this did not pan out. So Marx's next move is my personal favorite move, which is to basically just dismiss the rest of the criticism. I just think this is such a baller move, just to say, I've been dealing with your criticism about the property issue. I've been dealing with your criticism about, the payment issue, and now I'm just going to dismiss the rest of it entirely. The charges against communism made from a religious, a philosophical, and generally from an ideological standpoint are not deserving of serious examination. I included, my personal patronus, this little goat who doesn't believe you. And I think this is just such a great thing, and I encourage you to end all of your essays this way. If you run out of, compelling arguments about why you're correct, you can just dismiss the haters out of hand. Just make this little face. Just go, and dismiss them and tell them they're not serious of examination. So he closes part 2 with these sentences, which are themselves, I think, very beautiful. The history of all past society has consisted in the development of class antagonisms that assumed different forms at different epochs. So this is just a reflection of the sentence with which he began, this idea that all of history is just based on class antagonism. But whatever form they may have taken, one fact is common to all past ages: the exploitation of one part of society by the other. So his argument here is not just that there are two different classes, but that one is holding the other one down. That it's not just a matter of differences, it's a matter of power, and it's a matter of abusing that power. Okay, so Marx ends this section with his 10 very specific ideas about how communism might work. And I also love this section because some of them are great, some of them are incredibly solid, and some of them are just full-on nonsense. So let's get started. Number 1, abolition of property and land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. So here, it's not necessarily that you won't have a house, it's just that the rent that you pay on your house will go back into the public pot. So if you imagine essentially all money that everyone has is just sort of in one big pile, his idea here is that when you pay rent, that money will just go back into the pile. And we do have something sort of like this. Like if you think about public parks or state parks, those are public lands. They technically belong to all of us, and technically all of us fund them because we pay for them with our taxes. So this can work a little bit, but it never worked all the way. Number 2, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Now, this one might sound familiar. Again, if you've been paying attention to the Democratic primary race, or really to pretty much any political contest in the last couple decades, this is something that people talk about all the time. We love this idea that people who are more wealthy should pay more in taxes. Sometimes, of course, we hate this idea, so really we just go back and forth. But this idea of a progressive tax, not new and somehow still very popular. Number 3, abolition of all right of inheritance. So this is also something that we talked about when we talked about Rousseau, this idea that what you inherit from your parents is multifold. So yes, you might inherit wealth in the sense of inheriting money, but you might also inherit other things that are sort of less tangible. And Marx's argument is that if we get rid of inheriting wealth, we might be able to get rid of the other sort of social powers that come with wealth. Because very often, if you have wealthy parents, you also have a good education, and you also have valuable social contacts, and you also have this sort of, social knowledge that the other like lower classes don't have. And so his idea is that if we abolish inheritance, we can end up on a sort of a more level playing field. So that even if you do manage to accumulate wealth over the course of your life, if you cannot pass that wealth to your children, then all of the children will end up on a more level field starting out. They'll have, again, that sort of level playing field. This one, also not popular. We've talked a little bit in class about inheritance laws and how they can, really benefit the people who are trying to pass wealth down. And that is because we want to benefit the people to whom we are passing wealth down. Generally speaking, people want to pass their wealth to their babies. So this one, unpopular. Number 4, confiscation of property of all immigrants and rebels. So this rule means that if you leave, now remember, immigrant with an E and one M is people who leave, and immigrant with an I and two M's is people who come. So if you leave, or if you are thrown in jail for some act of rebellion, then we get to keep your house. This one, also unpopular. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. Okay, this one didn't work at all. This is probably the worst one. This idea of consolidating all of the money and especially all of the credit and all of the interest into the hands of one bank is a great example of something that makes sense on the surface, but in practice goes very poorly. So on the surface, this would make sense. We would just have one bank. We could all go to the same bank. That bank would handle loans. That bank would handle interest. Like there would be only one answer for all of the sort of, monetary and banking questions. However, in practice, this is one of the places that corruption has really been powerful. Almost every time that we've seen somebody try this, try having just one national bank, it has gone very poorly. This is one of the sort of peak areas that corruption can really get its hands into. So if you've ever played the game Monopoly, that game was meant to show you that monopolies are in fact bad. And this is a great example of that. This idea that if you have a monopoly in banking, you run out of choices, and the consumer has no options. And so this, although in theory could be very neat and clean and organized, has instead almost exclusively gone evil. This one has also gone evil. Number 6, centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. So again, this one's twofold. So the means of communication has turned out to be a super interesting one. So again, Marx didn't know necessarily what we would have for communication in the future. Like there was no way he could have imagined, state-run television, for instance. But that's a great example of the way that this has gone wrong. So if you think about North Korea, they have a state-run media, and there's essentially 3 problems with that. And one is they filter all of the information coming in, so you don't know what's going on in the rest of the world. Number 2, they have no reason not to lie to you. They can always tell you that everything is going fine, and that, the world leader is a perfect and beautiful man who wins golf all the time and things like that. This example here at the bottom is actually from 30 Rock, the television show, so it's a joke, but it's kind of a great example of the way that the media can just tell you whatever they want you to know because you don't have any means of knowing otherwise. And the third reason that it can get dangerous is that there's also no means of getting information out. So similar to the way that, for instance, we don't know what's going on in North Korea necessarily, they don't know what's going on in the rest of the world. So having all communication and all media in the hands of the state, again, is just a recipe for disaster. It can very quickly get throttled and get full of misinformation. Having all transportation in the hands of the state, similarly, could go really well. You could end up with, clean and fast and efficient public transport, but again, in practice, has almost exclusively gone poorly. MARTA is not state-run. That's one of its problems, actually. But MARTA is, I think, a great example of the way that transportation can be run incredibly poorly. MARTA is sort of an example of what not to do for other places, which is embarrassing. But if you think about it, it only runs in 2 directions, and there's a couple of buses, and they only show up sometimes. So having all of your options for transportation sort of funneled into one government program, as you can imagine, can get real ugly. Okay, number 7. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state. So essentially, in this case, all of the factories, all of the production will be owned by the state, but they do want to expand them into more programs. And where it gets interesting is the second part. The bringing into cultivation of wastelands and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with the common plan. So this is actually very forward thinking. He had noticed, as had many other people, that industrialization was not good for the environment. There was a lot of pollution, there was a lot of waste products, there's a lot of focus on growing, cash crops, but not on cultivating the soil. And so one of his plans was that as production was expanded, so too was the protection of the earth essentially expanded. And this is really interesting. This is something that might actually have gone a far way to changing the way that we think about climate change these days. If we had thought from the beginning about what we should do about the soil, what we should do about the water, what we should do about the air, we might not be in the position that we're in today. So this one I think is actually kind of interesting. It didn't play out, turned out not to be economically feasible, but still interesting. Number 8, equal liability of all to labor. So what that means is it sort of goes back to that first quote, from each according to their abilities. So liability of all to labor means that you are expected to work. Everyone is expected to have a job. This book at the bottom is a children's book, but it's true. Everyone has a job on the farm. So essentially, if you can work, you will work. And that is one of the crucial tenets of communism that has also proven to not be popular. The second part of this is about food. Establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. So one of the things that he was worried about was how we were going to feed everybody. And what he thought might work best is if we applied the same processes to farming that we were applying to industry. So that essentially we took this division of labor, we took the machinery, we took the super focused aspect of farming, and that way we could create more food than we ever had before. And this kind of did happen. If you look at modern farms, most of the farming these days is done by just a few people and a lot of machines. So this idea of applying the knowledge that we had collected in the factories to the farms was not entirely bad. So this one, kind of a mixed bag. On the one hand, people don't enjoy liability to labor. On the other hand, the industrialization of agriculture did allow us to produce a lot of food. Number 9, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries. So again, he's talking about taking that giant workforce and also putting them to work farming. That worked. The second part we did not like. Gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population over the country. So essentially, he wanted to move people out of the cities and get everybody a little bit more spread out so that we would have less of a sort of a concentration of humanity in the cities and then great swaths of empty acres, so that we would have a few people per acre, essentially, that we would spread ourselves out such that we were occupying the whole land and not just concentrated in a couple of really dirty, disease-infested cities. Again, we didn't care for that one. At the bottom here is a map that represents where most of the population is in America. And again, if you look, we're mostly concentrated in a few places. Here we all are in the Northeast. That's where a lot of Americans live. A lot of Americans, again, here on the coast. And here's us, yay! There's a lot of people in Atlanta. So we don't like to be told where to live. We want to live where we want to live. So this one didn't pan out. Number 10, free education for all children in public schools, and abolition of children's factory labor in its present form. We liked this one. This one went great. We do have free education. Well, it's tax funded, but still free public education for all children. And we did abolish child factory labor. So this one panned out, as you can see by the suspiciously happy faces of these multi-ethnic children. So here is how he closes out this chapter with the sort of rephrasing of the ideas that have been crucial all the way through. Political power, properly so called, is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another. So again, he's returning to this idea that political struggles are also class struggles, and that moreover, the wealthiest among us are holding down the poorest among us. In place of the old bourgeois society, with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. So again, a more community-focused outlook. This idea that it's not enough for a few of us to develop and succeed and grow our wealth. What we need to be looking at is a community-wide development and success, that we need to be developing everybody around us and not just developing a few of the most wealthy among us. And that ends part 2. All right, if you've made it this far through parts 1 and 2, it's probably time for you to take a break. I think one of the things that we're all trying to adjust to is how to teach online, and now is probably a good time to do a little stretching, maybe go see if the sun is outside, and I'll meet you back here in a second. Okay, welcome back. So now we're on part 3, which is socialist and communist literature. So parts 3 and 4 are actually not that interesting. I'm going to tell you about them just in case, and because they do contain a little bit of useful information. But in parts 3 and 4, the main focus is talking about why all of the other communists did it wrong. So essentially, there have been a few communist movements in the past, and there were a few communist movements happening sort of simultaneously when they were writing this one. And they wanted to explain why their method was definitely the best method. And so to do that, they go through a series of different forms of communism and of communist literature and essentially dismiss them. So we begin with a whole section about people who are basically reacting to the things that are happening in the world around them. And Marx is mad at them because they're reacting instead of being proactive. So essentially they're just looking at what's happening and talking about it, and they're not, doing anything. So he's pretty mad about that. So there's 3 types of reactionary socialism that he wants to talk about. We start with feudal socialism. So if you remember, the feudal system was one where there's essentially a king or a person who's in power, and then they have a bunch of vassals, and the vassals have to give money or taxes or basically whatever they had, which was very often material goods, food and stuff, to the king as a sort of payment for living on his land. So when he talks about feudal socialists, he's talking about aristocrats who are still benefiting from the system. So they're not necessarily bourgeoisie in the sense that they own the means of production, but they're still very much at the top of society. So basically, the feudal socialists were a bunch of French and English aristocrats who were doing a bunch of writing, they were publishing these pamphlets about how this system with the bourgeoisie and the proletariats was bad. But the problem was they were mostly just saying this because they were afraid that this new system would destroy their lifestyle, that there would be a sort of upstart wealth, these sort of, I guess, what we would call bougie people today. And they were not wrong. So he said, in order to arouse sympathy, the aristocracy were obliged to lose sight, apparently, of their own interests, and to formulate their indictment against the bourgeoisie in the interest of the exploited working class alone. So they were writing all of these pamphlets that were like, oh, you're exploiting them, but they didn't, do anything. And in fact, they continued to buy things from the bourgeoisie, and they continued to profit from the existence of the bourgeoisie, sort of exploiting the working class. So this was really just a lot of talk. In political practice, therefore, they joined in all coercive measures against the working class, and in ordinary life, despite their highfalutin phrases, they stooped to pick up the golden apples dropped from the tree of industry. So obviously the most important thing about this quote is the fact that the phrase highfalutin is not only real, but it's old, and is part of the sort of more sophisticated versions of English that we no longer speak anymore. So if when you hear that you think of a hillbilly, that's because it's an old English word. So essentially he's arguing that they published a bunch of pamphlets where they're talking about how terrible this all is, but in reality, they are still buying the things that the industry is making, and they're still benefiting from it. That is why he is mad at them. Another thing that they also did was use Christianity to argue against the sort of changes that were happening in the world. They said that basically they didn't think that the workers should rise up and revolt because revolting was unchristian. But Marx says that he thinks that revolting is in fact very Christian, and that in fact Christianity is really socialist in terms of taking care of your neighbor and not accumulating wealth. So that part is sort of interesting, but he doesn't really expound on it in a way that I think would have been even better. Next, we talk about the petty bourgeoisie socialism. So the petty bourgeoisie, when he says that, he's talking about people who do own the means of production, but in like a very small way. So maybe they own a little shop or, like a little workshop. So they don't own a factory in which they exploit a bunch of workers, but they do have like a little tiny, amount of sort of stock in the game. So they knew that a rise in mass production would essentially destroy their way of life. Like, let's say you owned a little tiny soap shop. If a soap factory opened nearby and people could get soap for, 1/5 the price of what you were selling it, then you were probably going to go out of business. So that's what they were worried about, the petty bourgeoisie. The individual members of this class, however, are being constantly hurled down into the proletariat by the action of the competition, and as modern industry develops, they even see the moment approaching when they will completely disappear as an independent section of modern society. So again, these people were totally right. This is something that we've seen happening as a natural consequence of industrialization. Very often, the small businesses and the small manufacturers aren't able to stay open because it's simply too expensive to compete against the bigger industrial brands. So those people were correct. The interesting thing about what the petty bourgeoisie were sort of worried about was that they made a lot of very accurate predictions for what was going to happen in the future. So these are all direct quotes regarding what the petty bourgeoisie were concerned about. So they were concerned about division of labor and the effects of machinery, which again turned out to be fundamentally correct. They were concerned about the concentration of wealth. They were concerned about overproduction of certain goods and the way that that could create a sort of a crisis in the market. This is something that we see happening a lot, for instance, in like oil production. Like every once in a while we have so much oil that we don't need that much, and every once in a while we have so little oil that we pay a lot, so they weren't wrong. And they were also sort of ahead of the curve in terms of what about the working class. They were worried about the life of the proletariats being, nasty, brutish, and short. They were worried about, inequalities. They were worried about like not, knowing your neighbor, like a sort of a loss of community. So in a lot of ways, the petty bourgeoisie were sort of the predictors of the future. They really called what was going to happen. The problem was that the solutions that they offered up were kind of nonsense. Their number one solution was just to go back to the old way, like kind of destroy the factories and just go back to making everything in small batches by hand. And of course, that was never going to happen. Their second solution was just to kind of slow things down, to sort of, stick a branch in the tire, if you will, and to halt production or at least slow production down so that it wasn't an epic big sea change. It was just a much slower change. Obviously, neither one of these were particularly helpful. The next group of reactionary socialists are the German or, quote, true socialists. They called themselves the true socialists. So these were people who were looking at the French ideas, especially about, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat and like kind of what was happening in this world. And what they did was essentially translate those French texts into German and then pretend like it was their idea. So Marx did not care for this, and he's particularly angry because a lot of what was happening in the French industrialization wasn't happening in the German industrialization. So essentially, they didn't have this kind of bourgeois class in Germany that they had in France. So a lot of what they were saying was not only lifted directly from other theorists and other sociologists, it was also inaccurate in Germany itself. So he gets real salty about this part, which of course I enjoy. German philosophers, would-be philosophers, and the beaux esprits eagerly seized on this literature, only forgetting that when these writings immigrated from France into Germany, French social conditions had not immigrated along with them. So, throwing shade, throwing shade. Next, we move on to essentially the other side of the argument. So we started with this sort of reactionary socialism, like, oh no, won't someone think of the children? And now we're into a more conservative version of socialism. So the conservative socialists are basically like sort of well-meaning, nice rich people, but essentially it's like they don't want anyone to be hurt, but also they don't have any viable solutions. So they want the best for society, but they pretty much just like talk about it and then go home and everything goes back to the way it was. So he makes the same argument sort of twice, and the idea here is that they want the good things but without the bad things. The socialistic bourgeois want all the advantages of modern social conditions without the struggles and dangers necessarily resulting therefrom. They desire the existing state of society minus its revolutionary and disintegrating elements. So that's sort of a long and more complex way of saying the second sentence, which is they wish for a bourgeoisie without a proletariat. So essentially they want all the good parts and they don't want any of the bad parts. And it gets kind of worse from there, which is to say that they don't want the people who are suffering to complain, because, that kind of ruins their vibe, man. It but requires in reality that the proletariat should remain within the bounds of existing society, but should cast away all its hateful ideas concerning the bourgeoisie. So essentially they want you to stay poor and working, they just want you to stop complaining about it, because, they don't like that. The third and final group that he talks about are the critical utopian socialists and communists. So these are the people who are sort of from on the outside looking in, and so they're talking about the movement, and sometimes they're thinking critically about it, and sometimes they're sort of refusing to acknowledge what else might be going on here. So these are not people who have their feet on the ground, so to say. These are mostly people who are reading about it or who are talking about it, and they don't want to, leave the ivory tower like they say about us academics. They just want to offer solutions from afar. The undeveloped state of the class struggle, as well as their own surroundings, causes socialists of this kind to consider themselves far superior to all class antagonisms. They want to improve the condition of every member of society, even that of the most favored, hence they habitually appear to society at large. So basically, the things that they're saying are very appealing because they're basically saying, look, everything's going to be fine. We don't need to fight. We can just be chill. And some of the things that they talk about are kind of rational. These socialist and communist publications contain also a critical element. They attack every principle of existing society. Hence, they are full of the most valuable materials for the enlightenment of the working class. So some of the stuff that they're saying is good. Some of these, critical examinations of what's going on are correct and they are insightful. So that part, not terrible. But the practical measures proposed in them point solely to the disappearance of class antagonisms, which were at that time only just cropping up. So essentially, the things that they're talking about are happening. They're trying to act like they're not happening, but they are happening. And the fact that they're refusing to examine these class antagonisms kind of invalidates the rest of their arguments. He ends it by saying, these proposals, therefore, are of a purely utopian character. So essentially, we can't take much of what they say seriously because it's existing in an imaginary utopian world instead of existing in the real, much darker and much more antagonistic world. So that brings us to the final part 4, position of the communists in relation to the various existing opposition parties. So this part is essentially about the way that the communists think about all the other movements that are happening sort of simultaneously in their world. The communists fight for the attainment of immediate aims, for the enforcement of the momentary interest of the working class, but in the movement of the present, they also represent and take care of the future of that moment. So essentially, the communists are very interested in what's happening right here at the moment, what's happening to us in the factory today, but they are also trying to think about the future, what will happen in the factory next year, next week, what will happen to our children. So the communists that are acting on the immediate causes also need to be thinking about the future causes. So this is the way that he phrases it. In short, communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against existing social and political order of things. So this is a pretty bold statement. He's basically arguing that all of the communists love all of the other communists, and that also all communists love all revolutionaries, and that every communist supports every revolutionary movement. And obviously this can't be true. Communists are not a monolith. They do not all love all the same things. They do not all support all the same things. So this is kind of a grandiose statement that doesn't really have any sort of basis in reality, but it sounds nice. And it leads us to the best part, the final sentence. Working men of all countries unite. And this isn't just me being dramatic with the caps locks. He used all capital letters. So you can tell it's supposed to be yelled. So you may remember how I told you at the very beginning that this is the piece of literature with the greatest beginning and ending sentence. And here it is, the ending sentence. So if you see this sentence somewhere else in the world, you'll know exactly what it's referencing. But it sums up his whole argument, which is that being a proletariat is the same everywhere you go, that class antagonism is the same everywhere you go, that inequality is the same no matter what language you're speaking, and that essentially the way to create a revolution is for the working class to unite and rise up against the owner class, and then sort of flip the script, create a new society. So you may be asking, how did this all work out? Now that we know all about the Communist Manifesto itself, and we have a little bit of an idea about communism, let's go through and see how it worked out. All right, so it may not shock you to learn that communism went pretty poorly. There's a lot of arguments here about this, and one of the primary arguments, of course, is that, quote, real communism has never been tried. Almost every time that we've seen it, it's gone incredibly wrong, and that's usually because of corruption. But let's talk about it. So there have been two main issues with communism. Number one, does it require a violent uprising? Marx argued that it did. He argued that the workers needed to unite and they needed to revolt. And what we saw in a lot of places was that, in fact, the workers did unite, but they didn't revolt so much as they unionized. So they were able to change their working conditions, but not by overthrowing the power. This is also perhaps true because, again, people hate to unite. It's really difficult to get a bunch of people, especially disempowered people who are afraid of losing their jobs. It's very difficult to get them together to unite against the forces that be. So the uprising part, not great. Also, the plan that he laid out is, in fact, not viable. You may remember the list of 10 things that he wanted. Some of those were great, but others of them were a hard no. So, in fairness, we do have to start by admitting that there have not been any successful attempts at pure communism, which is to say that, perhaps it could still be done, but there's been some other attempts, some of which were very poorly executed indeed. So let's start with the way that you might get to communism. So Marx himself argues that sometimes, in order to transition from capitalism to communism, you need to make a stop at socialism on the way. So a lot of countries basically became socialist with the intention of becoming communist after that. So the idea is that you will transition from private ownership to public ownership to sort of public ownership of everything. But one of the most crucial parts of this is that you are supposed to have a democratic election in the middle. So if you are, currently a capitalist nation, you're supposed to turn socialist to have a democratic sort of revolution. You're supposed to vote for all the people in government. You're supposed to give yourself a little bit of time to vote them out in case that went poorly, and then you become communist. So a lot of these countries that are listed here on the left say that they are sort of socialist on the way to communist. But what very often ends up happening is that certain elements of this aren't completed. So if you look on the left here, these are all of the sort of ideals involved in communism. Who owns the factors of production, who is considered to be valuable, like how do we determine allocation of goods. And I'm not going to read this chart to you because that would be boring. But as you can see, essentially, communism has a very specific goals, and a lot of these failed on the way. The column that's titled Fascism over here on the right is especially interesting because what we've seen several times is that instead of becoming communist, they instead became fascist. So the people were already incredibly disempowered, so it was easy for one sort of, corrupt dictator to take over. And this is often what we end up seeing, is that instead of allocation being determined by supply and demand or some sort of plan, it's allocated by a central plan, but often that central plan is not good. It tends to be subject to corruption, shall we say. Small-scale communism has worked a little bit. Having communes is actually a very old thing, and so we have seen sort of the rise of several communes that call themselves communes since the Communist Manifesto came out. And there are several examples in America. The New Harmony Farm and the Brookhaven Farm, or sorry, the Brook Farm, were both really the prime examples of this. This idea that you could get a bunch of people together who would live cooperatively on the land and share and, sort of allocate goods according to needs, that essentially on a small scale you could have communism work out. So the problem with these communes is that very often they don't last more than about 25 years, if they last that long at all. Typically speaking, humans just, I guess, aren't into sharing. We're seeing a resurgence of this, interestingly, especially in California. We're starting to see more people open communes, and especially in places where housing is incredibly expensive. Like in San Francisco, a lot of people are living communally again. So it could be that we're looking at another rise in communes, but I'm going to say probably not. So that brings us to our real question. And the problem with online teaching, which is that, of course, I cannot turn and look at your faces and ask you. So one of the things that I'd like for you to discuss when we're discussing things online this week is this question of why it doesn't work. Because it's such a beautiful example of something that appears to make sense on its face, like what if we could just share and be nice and get along, but never makes sense in practice. So one of the things that I want for us to be able to think critically about as we discuss this book is why this fails every time we try it. And be warned, there are a lot of answers to this question, but looking at why this sort of thing happens is a very important part of understanding, human nature and governments in general. So that ends our lecture on the Communist Manifesto. Thank you for joining me. Again, I miss you very much, and this is no way to teach, but I hope that you are happy and safe at home.